Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube. This week's Parsha is Vayera. Abraham argues with God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, but he doesn't argue with God so much on moral or ethical grounds, but primarily on theological grounds. He adjures his newly found God that it would not be godlike to act in a way that conflicts with the way he perceives God. We explore this argument and the resulting phrase, chas v'chalila. So, join us for God Forbid. Well, here we go, Rabbi. Just last week, we had Abraham discover God, and already he's arguing with him. And if you recall, what he did is last week, he discovered inside of himself that he cared for that burning house. And he surmised from there must be a greater being who cares for all of us. So it's kind of natural, I guess, that something like this would eventually happen. And we took no time at getting here. The plot moves quickly, does it not?
The plot, these two parshiot are amazing, the way the plot, twists and turns with Abraham. And like you said, he's fighting with God. And of course, the interesting thing in this week's parsha is he fights with God, and then he seems to accept when God says, sacrifice your son. So it's hard to figure out exactly what the issues are that Abraham's willing to fight for. But let's study it together and let's try to figure it out.
And you're going to have to wait a year for us to discuss the Akedah, because today we're just going to focus on Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's a tease. You got to subscribe. Anyway, we are in Genesis 18:17. And, there was this story about three angels walking by, and Abraham invites them in, and Sarah prepares a meal, and they learn that they're going to have a baby in a year's time. And after that story finishes, God says, I guess talking out loud, now God said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Since Abraham is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him, for I have singled him out, that he might instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of God by doing what is right and just, in order that God may bring about for Abraham what has been promised him. So all of a sudden from the get-go, the definition, the way he's talking comes right out of last week. Last week, he not only said that he loved Abraham was going to leave his homeland, but he also said you're going to be a blessing to the nations will bless themselves by you. And now that description or that prescription is, I wouldn't say haunting God, but it's constraining his actions all of a sudden. He's created by defining Abraham as his guy on earth. Now he has to start dealing with Abraham. He just got elected. He put in a new vice president and treasury secretary. He's got to bring them into the discussion. It is kind of fascinating, is it not?
It is absolutely fascinating. What's interesting about Abraham, we see it later with Moses, is that Abraham talks to God as if they're equals, right? That's something that, that we're not used to. It's always God and then it's humans. But Abraham and God are having a back and forth.
Absolutely. And the other thing that was fascinating to me is God says, I have to do la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. I have to do what is right and just. Now, if you take out your concordance and you look for mishpat, this is the first time it's used. So there's a lot left unsaid here. In other words, we have not seen in the Torah till now a description of God as necessarily being just, but it's taken for granted. It's pretty clear, and maybe it's because people didn't read this book cover to cover. They rolled through it year in and year out, so you have to assume they know what happens next. But it is interesting that we're starting to define God. God is defining himself. He's also defining himself by what Abraham thinks of him. But all of a sudden, we understand tzedakah and mishpat apply to this newly discovered God. And he talks a little bit about about Sodom and Gomorrah. And then in verse 22, it says that the agents, whether these were these angels or wayfarers, went on from there to Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before God. Avraham odenu omed lifnei Hashem doesn't seem to have much implications to it, but as the story progresses, actually everything that the text is saying is trying to say that Abraham is standing up for something. Abraham is making a move. He is presenting himself. He's asserting himself. In verse 23, Abraham came forward. Okay, so now he's not only standing, he comes forward and said, "Will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty?" So, in a sense, God decided I need to share this with him, almost as a preview, but Abraham does not need any coaxing. And he asks, how can you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? Af tispat sadik im rasha. And ha'af is when you put a hey in front of something, it becomes a question. So it's, are you telling me this? Then it says, what if there should be 50 innocent people? And we start getting into this negotiation over numbers. In verse 25, it says, far be it from you to do such a thing. Chalila lacha hashofet kol haaretz. Well, the first time he says, Chalila lacha maaseh kedavar hazeh lahamit tzadikim rasha. Far be it, and we're going to spend a little time on Chalila, as I said in the intro, but here we just assume it means far be it. Far be it from you, God, to do something like this. Then in the next verse, it says, far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty. So he says this chalila to God twice. The second time, chalila lacha hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'asem mishpat. Beautiful. Play on the words. How can the judge of the whole world not judge, I guess, with equanimity, with justice?
Well, that's the interesting thing from up in verse 19. Lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. We say God is defined as doing mishpat. And here Avraham is saying, you define yourself as doing mishpat, and how chalila la hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Right? That's what you just said, you do mishpat, and now you're not doing mishpat.
What is so fascinating is both by the way God prefaces it, as if we have an insight into God's inner thought, and the way Adam responds. The whole thing revolves around, and this is why I said in the intro, is a theological argument, how you define God, and therefore it's not descriptive, it's prescriptive. God now has to act in that way. Very fascinating. You know, you talk about this argument, you talk about standing up to God, but what he's really doing is defining and standing up to his definition of God. Now, last week, I shared with you this amazing Koran Tanakh. And so now every week I look at it, and they share a Hittite document that comes close to this. And I'll read from it, and it's 1300 BC, so it's pretty old. And it's a calamity has occurred. And the Hittite king says, "Oh gods, what is this that you have done? You have allowed a plague into Chati, and the whole of the Chati is dying. Whoever is a cause of rage and anger to the gods, and whoever is not respectful to the gods, let not the good ones perish with the evil ones. Whether it is a single town, a single house, or a single person, oh gods, destroy only that one." So it's fascinating, and I'm sure they went through a mass of documents to find something that really is similar. And what they point out is that while ancient Near Eastern people often viewed the gods as demanding that kings be just, the gods themselves did not always act justly. In contrast, Abraham expects God to act justly. The big distinction here is, number one, Abraham's story happens before the fact. In the Hittite document, he's complaining after the fact. But certainly what the comparative analysis of the sources do is they just emphasize what I said a second ago, which is that our scripture is defining God. It's writing God, he or she, into a box. This is what we expect of you, and this is what we need to get in response. So
I just think it's interesting. You say, we expect God to be in this box. We in 2024 have spent, almost 1,000 years in the Maimonidean understanding of God, which is kind of this very human understanding of God. Rambam really rejects that in a lot of ways. He says you can't understand God. But that's the way we look at God in human characteristics, that God should do mishpat. God shouldn't kill the righteous with the evil because we don't kill the righteous with the evil. But the truth, Jeffrey, is how do we know that God's bound by the same rules? And actually, if you want to be fancy, what you say is, look at the flood. God killed everybody in the flood. Why wasn't that argument made in the flood? It couldn't be that there was no one else except for Noah who was any good. But here with Abraham, Abraham is defined, as you said, Abraham is put in a box, and God is also put in a box.
I love that. And this kind of difficulty distinguishing between the two comes up in a fascinating Rashi. So I said a second ago, the angels had just left, and it says, Abraham stood yet before the Lord. If you read this in context, remember, it was God who was saying, I just can't leave this guy. I just appointed him to rule over the earth. I need to have a conversation with him. So Rashi says, but surely it was not Abraham who had gone to stand before him, meaning God, but it was the Holy One, blessed be he, who had come to him and had said to him, I need to talk to you. So we hear about an amazing rabbinic tool, and it's called Tikkun Sofrim. And Rashi says that what the rabbis actually did is they didn't feel comfortable with having God standing still in front of Abraham, so they changed the text. When 2 weeks ago we discussed Babel, Rabbi, we said the people who did the Septuagint were in 72 rooms, and they wrote the same thing. The truth is they didn't necessarily write the same thing. They changed the same 12 verses, and this is one of the verses that they all changed. So again, but what is it teaching us? It is teaching us that the rabbis understood the power of saying that Abraham stood in front of God. But what was more powerful from that is God felt a need to stay, linger, present his case in front of Adam. The rabbis understood the meaning and the power of these words, and that they were close to heresy, I may add. And that's why they literally had to change them. I just find that fascinating.
That is absolutely fascinating. And obviously, Tikkun Sofrim, that's almost like a rabbinic chutzpah. How did the rabbis have the right to change the words of the Torah? But the answer is that if the words of the Torah sound heretical, they have no choice but to change the words of the Torah.
Another way of saying that is that we are standing in rabbinic tradition when we say that we are reading a text that is as much an insight into man's thoughts as it is to God's. The men we're talking about, I mean the human beings, could be the rabbis who actually changed the text, or it could be Abraham who's making this argument. The next Rashi gets to, I said a second ago, ha'af tisapah means, wilt thou also destroy? Because af means if, and the hey in front of it makes it a question. Here too, the Rashi says in Onkelos, the Aramaic translation, he translates ha'af as angry. Will your anger urge you to destroy righteousness with the wicked? So it's not so much Abraham's anger, although I think what it's saying is this is a very passionate discussion, but he's almost attributing to God, how can you act this way? Did your anger take over you? I mean, the rabbis are doing everything they can to put emotion into and parse this conversation/argument between Abraham and his newly discovered God.
I say that, and again, it's the expectations. When you have an argument with somebody, you have expectations. I expect you to do something. I'm upset that you don't do it, so I get upset with you. So the fact that Abraham questions God, it's all based on expectations. Abraham has certain expectations of God. That's remarkable given the fact that we have never seen that before.
Yep. Yep. So now we're going to get into this Chalila a little bit. And for those who are listening, there are sometimes, it's amazing when you look at an ancient text like this to know that up until today, certain phrases are used. There are phrases like chas v'shalom, chas v'chilila, that people say they don't even know necessarily what they mean. I think typically, Rabbi, you would agree with me that its most basic uses is an accident happens, a calamity, an emergency happens. Someone talks about something evil or negative and they go, chas v'sholom, it should happen to me. Chas v'sholom, it should be part of reality. Here it's a little bit differently, but that's part of it. It's trying to take it away from reality.
Right. Well, take it away from me. Chas v'shalom. It distances us from the event.
I like that. So in the Midrash Tanhuma, it says, since the Hebrew word Chalila, far from thee, contains the letters of the word Chalala, profane. Remember when we talk about holy food, Kel Kodesh, and Chulin is profane or not holy things. So Chulin, in the verse, a woman is a harlot, should not be profaned. This verse implies that he was suggesting, would it not be a profanation of your name if you were to act this way? So I think the Midrash Tanhuma adds this concept of a name, but I think what Abraham is saying is a radical argument. I said in the intro, it would not be godlike for you to do this, God. But what we're saying is, if chulin means profane, if chulin means, even in modern Hebrew, a chiloni is a secular, you're like saying to God, this is not in character. This is not part of your script. You're becoming a godless God. It's a powerful argument.
In Yiddish, there's a phrase "pas nicht," which means it's not becoming of you. So we never say that to God, but that's what Avram's saying to God. Pas nicht. It doesn't look good for you, God, to allow this to happen.
Yep. Some of the other, Rashi goes on and says, Chalila lecha, and he says, usually God busies himself. He says it is a profanation of yourself. People will say this is what he usually busies himself with doing, retribution. The Ibn Ezra adds some more nuance to this. He says, far be it from you, Chalila, it is not possible. I think that's kind of in tune with the modern usage of it.
I think so.
Others say that Chalila is to be connected to the word halal, which means empty. Chol is empty. There is a movie that came out called Filling the Void. And in Hebrew, it was Lamale et halal. Void means empty. This becomes kind of fascinating that what the argument now becomes is, God, if you do this, it's as if you're not here. It's as if you've created a void. Here, last week, I just discovered you, and the world is full of you, and you're caring. And if you do this, Chalila, there's an empty void God is missing. I love that explanation as well.
That's a wonderful explanation. And maybe also Avram's trying to figure out God. Maybe that's a reasonable interpretation, that God isn't everywhere, that there's a void, fill the void. And that's what Avraham is challenging God. Are you telling me that you're not actually everywhere, that you're not here in stone because you're killing the righteous together with the innocent? Good. I love that.
So later on in Genesis, we're going to fast forward to when Joseph is the visor and the brothers are there, and Joseph, unbeknownst to his brothers, is acting like a visor, and he says, "You've stolen from me." And I believe it's the oldest brother, Judah, who says, "Why does my Lord," meaning Joseph, "say such things? Far be it from your servants to do anything of the kind." He uses the word chalila la'avdecha ma'aso hadavar hazeh. Rashi says it is a degradation. This is an expression denoting a shameful act. The Targum chas la'avdecha, a sparing to thy servants, signifies may there be a sparing from God upon that we would not do such a thing. The expression, this is Rashi talking, chas v'shalom, occurs often in the Talmud in this sense, forbearance and peace. Kind of interesting, because I think you and I both have heard chas v'shalom over and over again. What does it actually mean? How old is it? Rashi here is saying it is connected. It's been here for a while. And it basically, I think the way he's looking at it is, chas is kind of to care about something,
Right.
comfort something, and v'shalom. So it kind of is like saying the opposite. There should only be kindness and peace. This is impossible. This is not there. I think that might be the read.
Forbearance is an interesting word.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't expect forbearance and
No,
peace. I don't
no.
know exactly what that means, but okay. That we can't spend time on that. That's a question about from the translation.
Yep. So, in terms of this being used, Chalila maybe only occurs a few times in terms of the argument, but as I said before, the issue of Chilul Hashem, the issue of profaning God's name, is probably one of the key, driving forces in the Torah in terms of keeping the commandments. However bad it is that you break the law, it becomes badder still because you are mechalel et Hashem. You are desecrating God's name, and I think it really comes back to this moment. It works both ways. Abraham can say to God, if you don't act in a godly manner, you create this vacuum. But God mostly comes back to us, mankind, and says, you create this void, and you shine a bad light on my holy name. That's typically how it's used.
Right. I think that's right.
And again, heresy itself is techalel et shem Elokav. You go out and you profane something. This is a key argument. But what I love about our particular portion is Abraham is using an argument of a world without a God to God. That is striking to me.
That's the irony, that God is making a Chilul Hashem. Right? I mean, what does that mean? Right? Usually we make the Chilul Hashem. But what Abraham is suggesting to God is, God, you are making a Chilul Hashem. That's what's so strong.
Yep. So I did some searching on the internet in terms of what chas v'shalom, chas v'chalila actually means, where it comes from. Some interesting comments, and of course, God forbid is, I think, the standard, and that translates right into English. And I think people use it all the time. It's almost an international, or it's certainly an international English expression. A God forbid something. But some of the interesting things that I found is, number one, we talk about chulin as food that you're allowed to eat because it's not holy. People argue that's the source of the Islamic halal. Halal and chulin are the same. And of course, what we see today as chalila is very similar to halal. So it's fascinating when we find words that may give us insight.
Does anybody actually make the connection between those words?
Yeah, so I go to Strong's Concordance, and he has Arabic halal, Islam permissible according to Majlis religious customs. So that is a total parallel to chulin.
Hmm.
It's permissible. So now we know, Rabbi. Now we know.
That's great.
He
Okay,
did
that
make
is
that.
great.
He did make that connection. This whole idea of a secular world, a world where God is not there. It's an intriguing concept. It made me think of what Rav Kook thought. Rav Kook thought, and we all know that he loved the Chalutzim, he loved the pioneers, and we probably all think he loved them because he was just had a big heart and he wasn't judgmental, but he actually developed it into a philosophy. And he says that secular thinkers, they pull Judaism and religion far away from anything that is tangible. They reject, in a sense, like Abraham rejected last week, all of the idols and all that, and they have a way of purifying even religion. And he said he once went to a kibbutz and he showed up and they go, "Are you coming here to teach us something?" And he goes, "No, I'm coming here to have you teach me something." So if you look in the show notes, it's all there. But I think what is fascinating is that this word chulin, this word void, this word profane or not holy, comes up in this original argument and becomes this dialectic with God. And it's not altogether clear who is the player here. If you didn't have this argument with Abraham, it'd be easy to read the rest of the Torah where Chilul Hashem and desecrating God's name all was man's job or I should say hurdle to get over. But it makes it both on both sides. And if you look at the gamut of a Jewish history where we talk about God hiding his face and us standing up, or Yitzhak Greenberg talking about the third epoch where man has to fill the void, it really becomes a powerful, powerful story that continues all the way up till today. It's rather fascinating, and I think the way that the text really focuses on what God is thinking, what Adam is projecting onto God, is kind of powerful. Before I finish, I was reading a book called Arguing with God, which is obviously the week to read the book. And in it, he has a piyut that we say during the Rosh Hashanah services. And there it's trying to get God to move from the chair of mishpat to the chair of rachamim, from the chair of strict law and justice to the chair of mercy and forgiveness. And it turns our verse kind of on its head. It says, "Listen to the shofar blasts from on high, and exchange the seat of stern judgment for the throne of compassion. For the special son who was judged as he lay bound on the altar," that's the Akedah we read this week, "may his offspring, us, be generously spared from judgment. Far be it from you, O God of justice, Chalila from you, God of justice, be reminded of Abraham's word, should the judge of all the earth fail to judge righteously." The writer of the book says it's a mistranslation. The way he translates it is, "Remember, he shall not act justly." It's not a question. It tells God to get off the seat of justice and to move onto the seat of rachamim. So this dialectic never ends. Reading different sides into the story never ends.
I'll just say that that's often true about liturgy. In liturgy, we're willing to say things that we wouldn't say in commentary. And in liturgy, we actually take God on and he say, "God, you need to act justly." And that's amazing that in the Rosh Hashanah davening, when we need God to act mercifully with us, that we actually rephrase that. That's great. That phrase, "Chalil lecha," God, you should be ashamed of yourself, actually appears in the Yom Kippur davening too. So that's a great catch to find that in the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening.
I love the fact that we're ending with prayer, because while we can say our scripture is unique in some ways and maybe be focused on how it is, just recording this whole argument, I think in terms of Jewish prayer, to have arguing with God in your prayer. In the verses that we read, it says Vayigash, that Abraham approached God. The traditional commentaries say he prayed. So what you just said, Rabbi, really I think puts the icing on the cake, that the continuation of this kind of argument is in the daily prayer service, and it is part of being a follower of Abraham. And that, I think, is just absolutely amazing.
Fantastic. This was great today. This is a great parsha. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
And I'm staying on.